Pack your things, you're done here, effective immediately, my boss Richard Harrington announced in the middle of the open plan office, his voice deliberately loud enough to carry across all 4 departments on the 14th floor. And don't bother applying anywhere else in this industry. I'll make sure every firm in this city knows exactly what kind of employee you really are. 127 coworkers stopped typing, stopped talking, stopped breathing as they watched me absorb the public execution Richard had clearly planned for maximum humiliation. But why did I walk to the elevator without protest, without tears, without the breakdown he was obviously expecting, and why 2 years later? Did that same elevator deliver me to a lobby where the receptionist greeted me as the building's new owner? "Good morning, Ms. Ashford. Your building manager is ready for your inspection." I smiled at the receptionist, a young woman who hadn't been working here 2 years ago, who had no idea about the history she was witnessing. "Thank you. But first, I'd like to visit the 14th floor. Could you call up and let them know the new building owner is conducting a personal inspection of all tenant spaces?" Her eyes widened slightly. Tenant inspections by building owners were unusual, but she made the call. "They're expecting you, Ms. Ashford." I stepped into the elevator and pressed 14. The same elevator I had ridden in shame 2 years earlier. The same floor where Richard Harrington had destroyed my career in front of everyone. He had no idea I was coming. He had no idea I now owned the building his company leased. The firing had been designed to break me. Richard had called me into the center of the office, not his private office, not a conference room, but the exact middle of the open floor plan where maximum witnesses would observe my destruction. He'd waited until 3 p.m. on a Friday, ensuring the story would spread over the weekend without any official response possible. "You're incompetent, Vivian. Your work on the Morrison account was unacceptable. Your attitude has been problematic for months. I've tolerated it because I thought you might improve, but clearly I was wrong." None of it was true. The Morrison account had been sabotaged, not by me, but by Richard's nephew Bradley, who'd made critical errors I'd documented and reported. My problematic attitude had been raising concerns about irregularities I'd noticed in client billing. My incompetence had been threatening to become evidence of his competence issues. Richard had chosen to eliminate the problem by eliminating me. "Security will escort you out. Don't contact clients. Don't contact coworkers. Any attempt to damage this company's reputation will be met with legal action." I'd walked to the elevator surrounded by silence. 127 people had watched their colleague publicly humiliated, and not one had spoken up. I didn't blame them. Richard had made clear what happened to people who challenged him. The months after the firing had been brutal. Richard's threat to blacklist me hadn't been empty. Every application I submitted received the same response: "We've heard concerning things about your previous employment. We're not able to move forward." He called colleagues at every firm I applied to. He'd shared confidential concerns about my work ethic, my attitude, my reliability. He'd systematically poisoned the industry against me. By month 3, I'd stopped applying to firms in my field. By month 4, I'd depleted my savings paying rent while unemployed. By month 5, I'd moved in with a friend and started driving for a rideshare company just to survive. The career I'd spent 8 years building was gone. The pivot happened because I had no other choice. During those desperate months, I'd picked up work wherever I could find it. Data entry, virtual assistants, freelance projects for small businesses that couldn't afford real consultants. One of those small businesses was a property management company struggling with their accounting systems. I'd helped them reorganize their financials, identify inefficiencies, and streamline their operations. "You're good at this," the owner, Margaret, had observed. "Better than the consultants we paid 10 times as much." I was a financial analyst for 8 years. This is what I did. What happened? I'd told her the story, the firing, the blacklisting, the systematic destruction of my career. "That's illegal," she'd said flatly. "What he did, the coordinated campaign to prevent you from finding work, that's tortious interference. I can't afford to sue him." "Maybe not yet. But you could build something he can't touch." Margaret became my mentor, my advocate, and eventually my business partner. She'd spent 30 years in commercial real estate, building a portfolio of properties that generated steady income without requiring her constant attention. She understood the industry from angles I'd never considered. "The firms that blacklisted you, they all lease their office space. Every company needs a building. What if you controlled the buildings?" "I can't afford to buy buildings." "You can't afford to buy buildings yet. But you can learn the industry, build relationships, find opportunities others miss. Real estate rewards patience and knowledge. You have both." She'd started teaching me property valuation, market analysis, negotiation tactics, the financial engineering that turned modest investments into substantial returns. I'd absorbed everything, applying the analytical skills Richard had dismissed as incompetent to an industry he knew nothing about. The first acquisition came 18 months after my firing. A small office building in a transitional neighborhood, undervalued because the previous owner had mismanaged it, but positioned for growth as the area developed. Margaret and I had partnered on the purchase, combining her capital and experience with my analysis and hunger. We'd renovated strategically, attracted quality tenants, and tripled the property's value within a year. The second acquisition followed 6 months later. Then a third. Then a portfolio that grew as my reputation in commercial real estate established itself among people who never heard of Richard Harrington or his blacklist. The industry he'd banned me from wasn't the only industry that existed. The opportunity to buy the Harrington building came through a broker who didn't know my history. There's a Class A office tower downtown. The current owner is over-leveraged and needs to sell quickly. Prime location, stable tenants, below market price because they need to close fast. I'd recognized the address immediately. The building where I'd been publicly humiliated. The building where Richard Harrington's firm occupied the 14th floor on a 10-year lease. The building that represented everything I'd lost and everything I'd rebuilt. I'm interested. Send me the details. The due diligence revealed everything I needed to know. Richard's firm was one of 19 tenants. They occupied 12,000 square feet on a lease that had 7 years remaining. Their rent was below current market rates, a favorable deal they'd negotiated during a previous ownership transition. The building itself was sound but undermanaged. The current owner had deferred maintenance, lost good tenants through poor service, and failed to maximize the property's potential. I saw what it could become. I saw what I could make it. I also saw the opportunity I'd been waiting for without knowing it. The acquisition closed quietly. Building ownership changes rarely make headlines. The existing tenants received notification of new ownership, new management contact information, and assurances that their leases would be honored as written. Richard Harrington received the same form letter everyone else received. He had no idea who the new owner was. He had no idea his former victim now controlled the building his company called home. The inspection was my choice. I could have remained anonymous, plenty of building owners never personally visit their properties. But I wanted something more than passive ownership. I wanted Richard to know. Not for revenge, or not only for revenge. I wanted him to understand that his attempt to destroy me had failed. That the industry he'd banned me from wasn't the only path to success. That the woman he'd publicly humiliated had built something he couldn't touch. The inspection was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 2 years and 3 days after he'd fired me. The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor. The office looked different, new paint, updated furniture, some rearrangement of the open floor plan, but the essential layout was the same. The same spot where I stood absorbing Richard's public termination was now occupied by a cluster of desks where analysts reviewed spreadsheets. The receptionist for Richard's firm looked up as I approached. "Can I help you?" "I'm Vivian Ashford, the building owner. I'm conducting an inspection of tenant spaces." Her expression shifted through confusion, concern, and something approaching alarm. Let me get Mr. Harrington for you." "Please do." Richard emerged from his corner office 4 minutes later. He looked older than I remembered, more gray hair, deeper lines around his eyes. The confident swagger I recalled was present but diminished, as if the intervening years had worn away some of his certainty. He didn't recognize me immediately. "I'm Richard Harrington, managing partner. How can I help you, Ms. Ashford?" "Vivian Ashford." The recognition came slowly, a flicker of confusion, then dawning awareness, then something approaching shock. "Vivian? But I thought you left the industry? Disappeared? Failed?" I kept my voice professionally neutral. I pivoted. "Turns out the skills you called incompetent are quite valuable in commercial real estate." He was struggling to process the situation. The woman he'd publicly destroyed was standing in his office, holding the leverage of building ownership over his head. "What is this? Some kind of revenge scheme?" "This is a standard tenant inspection. I'm reviewing all occupied spaces to assess condition and identify maintenance needs." I gestured to the clipboard I'd brought. "Shall we walk through your space?" The inspection took 45 minutes. I examined everything: HVAC systems, electrical panels, window seals, carpet condition. I asked questions about the space, made notes, conducted myself with complete professionalism. Richard followed me like a man walking through a minefield, waiting for the explosion that never came. His employees watched with the same silent attention they'd given my firing 2 years earlier. But the dynamic was reversed now. They were watching their boss squirm under the authority of someone he'd tried to destroy. "Everything seems in good order," I said as we concluded. "Your lease runs another 7 years. We'll honor the existing terms, of course." "Of course?" Richard's voice was tight. "What does that mean?" "It means your lease is a legal contract, and I honor my obligations. Your rent will remain at the agreed rate. Your space will be maintained to building standards. Nothing about your tenancy changes because of who owns the building. Then what was the point of this inspection? The point was conducting a standard property assessment. The fact that you interpret my presence as threatening says more about your conscience than my intentions. I left the 14th floor without further incident. But I knew the story would spread. 132 people had watched that inspection, slightly more than had witnessed my firing. By end of day, the entire firm would know that their former colleague owned the building. By end of week, the industry would be buzzing with the reversal. Richard's blacklist had failed. Not only had I survived his campaign to destroy me, but I'd built something that put me in a position of power over him. The aftermath was deeply satisfying. Richard's firm suddenly became a model tenant. Maintenance requests were reasonable. Rent payments arrived early. Any interaction with building management was conducted with unusual courtesy. He was afraid of me. Not because I'd threatened him, I'd been scrupulously fair in all our interactions. But because he knew what he'd done, and he knew I knew, and he couldn't predict what I might do with that knowledge. The uncertainty was its own punishment. The broader impact revealed itself over months. Industry colleagues who'd once blacklisted me began reaching out. Some with apologies, I never should have listened to Richard. I'm sorry I didn't give you a fair chance. Some with curiosity, I heard you bought the Harrington building. That's impressive. Some with opportunity, we have a project that could use your expertise. Richard's campaign to destroy my reputation had been thorough. But reputations can be rebuilt, especially when the person who destroyed them is now visibly subordinate to their former victim. The story of what I'd accomplished spread further than the story of what Richard had done. People remembered the ending more than the beginning. I ran into Bradley, Richard's nephew, whose errors I'd been fired for reporting, at an industry conference a year later. He was working at a different firm now, apparently having worn out his welcome at his uncle's company. He looked uncomfortable when he recognized me. Vivian. I heard about everything. Everything? The building. The inspection. How you? He trailed off. I should apologize. The Morrison account, that was my mistake. I let you take the blame because I was scared of what would happen if the truth came out. You let your uncle fire me publicly and blacklist me across the industry to cover your errors, I know. It was wrong. I felt guilty about it ever since. Has that guilt led you to tell anyone the truth? He was silent. That's what I thought. You feel guilty, but not enough to actually do anything about it. I gathered my things to leave. I've built a career your uncle couldn't destroy. I don't need your apology or your guilt. I just needed you to know that I know exactly what happened, and I succeeded anyway. Richard's firm moved out of my building 3 years into their lease. They claimed they'd found space that better suited their needs, but the real reason was obvious. Richard couldn't handle working in a building owned by someone he'd wronged. Every day in that space reminded him of what he'd done and what I'd overcome. The penalty for breaking the lease early was substantial, nearly 2 years' rent paid in a lump sum. I accepted the payment without comment. The building continued to thrive. I'd improved management, upgraded common areas, attracted better tenants. The property's value had nearly doubled since acquisition. My portfolio had grown to include 6 additional buildings, each generating steady returns. The career Richard had destroyed had been replaced by something better, something I controlled completely, something no vindictive boss could take from me. I saw Richard one final time, 5 years after he'd fired me. We were at the same charity gala, the kind of event where industry people crossed paths whether they wanted to or not. He approached me during a lull in the evening. Vivian. I've been wanting to talk to you. About what? About what happened. The firing. The blacklist. All of it. Why now? Because I'm retiring next year. Because I've had time to think about my legacy. Because some things need to be said before it's too late. He paused, looking older and more uncertain than I'd ever seen him. I was wrong. What I did to you was wrong. The blacklist was wrong. The public humiliation was wrong. Yes, it was. I was threatened by you. By how competent you were. By how the partners kept praising your work. I was afraid you'd expose Bradley's mistakes, afraid the blame would eventually reach me. He shook his head. So I destroyed you before you could threaten me. It was cowardly and cruel. Is this an apology? It's the truth. Whether you accept it as an apology is your choice. I considered the man in front of me, diminished, remorseful, finally honest about what he'd done. The rage I'd carried for years had faded, replaced by something more like indifference. I accept that you're telling the truth. That's not the same as forgiveness. I don't expect forgiveness. Good. Because you won't get it. I looked at him directly, but I'll tell you something I've learned. What you did to me was the best thing that could have happened. You forced me out of a career where I worked for people like you, into a life where I work for myself. I'm wealthier, happier, and more successful than I would have been if I'd stayed at your firm. So thank you, Richard. Your cruelty made me better. He didn't seem to know how to respond. I walked away without waiting for one. The open plan office where I'd been publicly humiliated is a tech company's workspace now. They're better tenants than Richard's firm ever was, prompt with rent, reasonable with requests, appreciative of the building's management. They have no idea about the history of that space. Sometimes I visit the 14th floor during inspections and stand in approximately the spot where Richard announced my termination. I think about the 127 people who watched me walk to the elevator, and I wonder how many of them know what became of me. I hope they do. I hope they understand that public humiliation doesn't have to be the end of anything. I hope they understand that the woman who walked to that elevator with nothing walked back into that building owning it. He fired me in front of 127 coworkers. He told me I'd never work in the industry again. He blacklisted me at every firm in the city, destroying a career I'd spent 8 years building. I walked to the elevator in silence, broken and humiliated. 2 years later, I walked back into that same lobby as the building's owner. The receptionist smiled. "Good morning, Ms. Ashford. Your building manager is ready for your inspection." When Richard Harrington was called down from the 14th floor to meet his new landlord, he found me, the woman he'd tried to destroy, standing in the lobby of a building I now owned. He'd told me I'd never work in his industry again. He was right. I bought the industry instead.